Welcome to episode 70 of No Rares Required. We'll be covering 3 episodes this week to make up for me falling behind in my schedule, so hold on to your butts. Every week I cover the top performing commons and uncommons in limited or draft in a specific color, pair, or archetype that you vote for here on YouTube each week, and this week Rakdos or Black Red was at the top of the list. And the theme on MTG Arena is Suspect Aggro, and again, this is pretty accurate. But there are some suspect cards that are a bit of a trap. So I'm going to cover my draft skeleton, which consists here of 17 commons, 5 uncommons, and 1 rare. And since commons and uncommons make up the majority of a pack in a draft, that's what I like to make it. And it kind of gives you a consistent strategy to shoot for when you find yourself in that archetype. And you'll notice here that there is a great selection of removal in black and red, like Torch the Witness, Shock, Long Goodbye, Extract a Confession, Galvanize, Murder, and Deadly Complication. But you do need to focus on grabbing some threats at some point since you are aggro. So don't go over the top on removal. I do think that the archetype can struggle a little bit, especially because single point removal can struggle depending on the matchup, like if you end up against Boros. So don't go too crazy with the point removal. And then you've also got some great threats to start off on turn 1, like the Fester Leech and Snarling Gorehound I've enjoyed quite a bit. The Unscrupulous Agent I've liked as a 2-drop in black because it trades, up in the sense that like it will always be a 1-for-1 because it makes them discard. And then you have some really good options for going wide anytime that you're in red, like Dog Walker and Person of Interest are just very difficult for your opponent to keep up with and to be able to block. And then I like the Offender at Large as a way to make those 1/1s into relevant threats and to be able to push damage. And you may notice that not many creatures actually have Menace or Suspect. And that's largely because the Person of Interest and Dogwalker already require 3 blockers on their own. So keeping that in mind with the broad picture of what the archetype is trying to do, let's dive into the data on 17 lands and when the data suggests to take the cards, as well as alternative strategies that we could bring in during a draft. So first thing I like to do is calculate the total wins created, and I do this by taking the average of the game's played win rate and the average of the game in hand win rate on 17 lands, and then subtract the average win rate of all users in the archetype. And this is a nice way to kind of play around the skill level and see what's working for the majority of people in the archetype. And then I multiply it by the number of games played to kind of get that wins created. So top of the list here, we've got Person of Interest, followed by Shock, Extract a Confession, Runebrand Juggler, Torch the Witness, Deadly Complication, Long Goodbye, Reckless Detective, Offender at Large, Hunted Bone Brute, Unscrupulous Agent, Blood Spatter Analysis, Rakdos, Patron of Chaos, Snarling Gorehound, Case of the Stashed Skeleton, and Galvanize. If you don't know what those are, we're going to be covering them shortly here in a second. And then total wins destroyed. We can do kind of the same process, but for what is negatively affecting the archetype. And I do have to admit that I discovered a flaw in my calculations this week. Some of the previous wins destroyed were incorrect because of insufficient data. Specifically in the numbers of games in hand, win rate was coming up 0, and then I was averaging it, so I was basically cutting their win rate in half. And so if you go back and look at the previous weeks, do keep that in mind that the total wins destroyed is not entirely accurate, and that's partially why there were some really good cards in there that were like, well, that's kind of a head scratcher, why was that in the bottom? So this has been fixed for this week, and we see a lot less off-color cards now. So top of the list, the number 1 trap in Rakdos to avoid is Basilica Stalker, followed by Shady Informant, Repeat Offender, Suspicious Detonation, Demand Answers, Goblin Maskmaker, Macabre Reconstruction, Harried Dronesmith, Innocent Bystander, Gearbane Orangutan, Cerebral Confiscation, Crime Novelist, Rubble Belt Braggart, Agency Coroner, Concealed Weapon, Judith Carnage Connoisseur, which funny to see Judith there on the list for sure. I'm going to try to spend a little bit less time going into each card specifically. So if you aren't familiar with what those cards are, I think that I don't know what to do exactly. So I'm gonna try to appeal to people who are already familiar with the set, and leave it up to you to kind of look those up if you aren't familiar with them, and kind of just go for overall overall stuff that we can kind of take away from it, right? So Repeat Offender is one of the menace creatures, but it only can go as suspect creatures. It's a 2/1 that you can then make into a suspect, or if it's already suspected, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It's just very expensive to be able to get that to work. The Harry Dronesmith hasn't been particularly good with the 1/1s. There's not a lot of sack synergies in Rakdos this time around. Same with the Gearbane Orangutan. That's better if you can have like something to pump it with. The Macabre Reconstruction is the Graveyard Loop stuff, and then the Cerebral Confiscation is the Mind Rot. So those just haven't worked particularly well in this set. Rubber Belt Braggart is another one that is a 5/5 for 5 that gets suspect when you attack, and that one has been kind of a trap. So, and then Judith really wants, you can make Judith work, but it's a little bit more of a build around than what you would normally be doing in the archetype, because you do need a lot of instant and sorceries to make Judith pop. So if you do that, you do need to take that with an asterisk of like, you need to be doing that as a build around strategy. And then after that, I like to take the wins created and divide them by the number of times that the card was picked and graph it against the average taken at, and fit the data with a logarithmic regression. And what this allows me to do is kind of sift through the data on 17 lands and figure out what the top performing cards are at different time points within the draft. And so top of the list here, we've got the Rakdos Patron of Chaos, which is the Mythic Rakdos rare. And we've got Vein Ripper, which has been an absolutely awesome bomb regardless of what archetype that you're in. We've got the Hunted Bone Brute, which has been another impressive black one that's a perfectly good pack one, pick one. We've got the Case of the Stashed Skeleton, which is, you know, being able to put a 2/1 onto the board with Menace, and then if that Menace creature dies, being able to turn this into a Demonic Tutor has worked really nicely. We've got the Homicide Investigator, which a lot of times just trades, honestly, with another, like with a 3-drop ward 2/2 creature, and then you get a clue token. That's totally fine. We've got the Lamplight Phoenix, which is a nice recurring threat as long as you have the evidence to kind of support it, which this archetype doesn't have as much of the collect evidence synergies, but you still, it's still an excellent bomb, an excellent pack one, pick one. Massacre Girl is a 4/4 menace for 4 that your creatures get Wither, and so your damage becomes permanent, and then this just allows you to draw into more threats, which fits perfectly fine into an aggro strategy. Pyrotechnic Performer has been really good in every red deck. Being able to flip things up and deal additional damage makes your morph creatures push even more damage. It works really well with the Bone Brute. You can swing in suddenly for like 15 damage with that card. Deadly Cover-Up is the last one that I really look for, a pack one, pick one in the Rakdos archetype. And Deadly Cover-Up is a Wrath that you can then collect evidence 6 and remove a problematic threat. So we don't care about the rares anyway. The whole point of this podcast is no rares required. So the real juice of this is the value of a replacement for picks 2.5 through 5. And these are kind of the cards that will lead me into the archetype when I see them available in a draft. So top of the list here, we've got the Blood Spatter Analysis, which allows you to deal 3 damage, and then whenever a creature dies, you can put a Bloodstain counter on it, and then if you have 5 or more, you can sack it to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Honestly, it's just good to have removal, right? I mean, the 3 damage to a creature for a black and a red isn't amazing, but in the games where it does actually stick around late enough to give you additional value, then that's great. Long Goodbye has been really good. I'll point out again that you want to be careful about if they have 5 mana and are able to flip their creature up into something that will then make this spell fizzle. Otherwise, it's a great way to get around ward because the spell can't be countered, so don't pay the ward cost. Torch the Witness has been really great. It's removal and card draw in 1 card. Reckless Detective is a 2/3 that causes you to not loot, rummage every time that it attacks, and you can also sacrifice an artifact, so you can sacrifice like a clue token or a 1/1 or something like that, and it helps smooth your draws early on, which is very important for the aggro and tempo strategies. Shock is excellent. I've talked about this one before. Being able to remove ward creatures for the same amount of mana that your opponent invested is great. And then in a pinch, you can always go, not even in a pinch, you can always go face with it as well. Leering Onlooker I really like, especially because there are some mill synergies and surveil synergies in Rakdos that I'm looking to lean on. And so if this goes into your graveyard, that's just free value. And then we've got Murder, which has the problem that it's not particularly good if you're paying 5 to remove a Grey Ogre. So paying 5 to remove their disguised creature that they paid 3 for. is not great. But if they're flipping into a bigger threat, you just gotta wait for the moment for murder to shine, and it will, right? Whether or not it's removing a bomb that's not disguised, whether or not, if you're hitting something like a Hellion that just flipped over for a bunch of mana, you can still make murder work, and sometimes you have to work for it a little bit. Case of the Burning Masks is really good. You get removal that then turns into a exile effect where you exile the top 3 cards of your library, so you get dig as well as removal in 1 card. And then Dogwalker, this has been amazing in every red and white archetype, so it's hard to find the Dogwalkers compared to week 1, but occasionally you still find them. And so taking them, picks 2 and onward is kind of where I'm looking and willing to take a Dogwalker. I do think that it is that powerful of a card, especially in an aggressive go-wide strategy. Galvanize is really great. You'll have a little bit harder time than blue-red at drawing your second card to deal 5 damage, but still instant speed, 1 and a red to deal 3 damage to a creature is good removal. Undercity Eliminator allows you to pop a token and exile something, and the exile can be really nice because of cards that have interesting effects when they die, like the Cold Case Cracker in blue. And so I've been impressed with this card. And Coerce to Kill, because you're an aggro strategy, you really don't want to be splashing, but there are a couple of cards that are worth splashing. And Coerce to Kill, because it costs 5, it gives you a long time to find that extra blue mana, and then it's a 2-for-1, right? So I think Coerce Kill is still good enough, and the data suggests that consider splashing it even in your Rakdos aggro decks. And then as far as value over replacement, picks 5 through 8, this is kind of where, like, once you've established that you are in Rakdos, then these are kind of the undervalued uncommons and commons that you can still look to pick up. And top of the list here, we've got Runebrand Juggler, which is the Rakdos Signpost uncommon. And I've kind of found this to be a theme throughout the set, is that pick 5 is a really great time to look for signposts that are still left over. And I will often use that as a signal, as a direction to go, especially if my pack 1 path has kind of hit a wall and I'm looking for an alternative place to pivot. So keep that in mind. I hope that will help you out. Deadly Complication, as well as like the Rakdos specific removal. You get to destroy a creature while also putting a +1/+1 counter on something that is suspected, and then you can get rid of the suspect. And you do have cards that are suspects, right? I mean, like there is not as you're not filling your entire deck with them, but like Person of Interest, the Frantic Scapegoat, like there's a couple here that were like you'll still have the option to lean a little bit on the suspect synergies. But Person of Interest is another one that's like you're going to see this every time that you're in red. It's a great common. The fact that you can still pick them up after pick 5 is excellent. This is a little bit worse on defense because you get a 2/2 for 4, and because the other part of it can't block. But if you are on offense, then this requires 3 blockers. Otherwise, you are guaranteed to get damage through. So this kind of card is what is making the play versus draw feel a little bit worse in this set. Fester Leech is one of the cards, like I mentioned at the beginning, that has synergies with the Leering Onlooker, and it threatens very well in a format where everybody is playing 2/2 ward 2 creatures, because you can pump it for +2/+2. So don't be afraid of the self-mill, lean into the aggression of the Fester Leech. I had a trophy that was running 4 of them. Extracted Confession I've really enjoyed because it is a little bit matchup dependent, because there are stuff that, there are a fair amount of 1/1 tokens in this set. But if they do have that, then you need to collect evidence to snipe the useful stuff. And there are some times where their board is just going to be empty. And since you kind of have this go wide thing, even removing just like a 1/1 isn't the end of the world if that's what it ends up being at the floor. Clandestine Meddler didn't make it into my draft skeleton, but it was close. I like this one because, like, if you put this on a Fester Leech, you immediately get to start surveilling on top of just filling your graveyard for collect evidence synergies, and you can give something suspect to hit in for a fair amount of damage. So I've been impressed with this card in Rakdos specifically. Unscrupulous Agent, as I mentioned at the beginning, I really enjoy a 1/1 that makes them discard a card. The more that you have, then this is a card that's like, it's bad to draw later in the game, but if the game is going late, then you're kind of in trouble already, right? Because the format, especially this archetype, doesn't block or play defense particularly well. The slimy dual leech I've enjoyed in a couple of the archetypes, specifically in Orsov and in Rakdos, because you are playing this aggressive strategy. It does not work very well on defense, right? You're playing a 2/4 on defense, but on offense you're playing a 3/4 death touch, and you can give other things the +1/+0 and death touch, and kind of the versatility of that option can play really well as long as you're turning them left. Same thing goes for Red Herring, a card that can't block but is a 2/2 haste on turn 2. I've been impressed with that as long as you're in an aggro plan. Night Drinker Mori is the 4/2 flyer that has disguise for double pit black, and when it enters the battlefield you lose 3 life. I think honestly you can go either way with this card too. I don't think that you need to avoid losing the 3 life, because it does die to shock, but you are trying to push damage, and so this works. This also works really well with the Pyrotechnic Performer because it flips up and deals the 4 damage. But do take note of the double pit black in case you are majority red. Kind of, don't get stuck with this being a ward 2 creature. It's happened to me. Gadget Technician I've also been really impressed with, but you do have to have the double pip red. So there can be a little bit of a burden in your mana, right? If you're running Murders and the Night Drinker Moris and then the Gadget Techs. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that even though the archetype doesn't splash very well, I do like to run the Escape Tunnel, just because then it helps me make sure that I have the double pip for both colors. So like an 8/8 split with 1 Escape Tunnel is kind of like my go-to aggro build in this set. Just because especially like lower mana curves haven't been particularly good because of how much disguise there is. I haven't really found a lack of use for my mana. Frantic Scapegoat is another one that has that natural suspect synergies and is one of the suspect creatures that like gets the thumbs up. Being able to play this and then put the suspect onto a dog walker can push an incredible amount of damage very early on in your curve. I guess that's more for Boros because you're able to turn 2 dog walker, but still you can make something have menace on your turn 2 drop or your 3 ward and push some damage with the Frantic Scapegoat. Bulrak Clan Basher, I definitely recommend for Rakdos, especially because like if you're removing your opponent's threats and attacking in, they have to decide on what they're multiple blocking and how they're distributing their blockers, and Bulrak Clan Basher can just flip up for an obscene amount of damage, especially if you're combining this with things that can pump its power, like the Offender at Large that we'll cover here shortly. And then Escape Tunnel, like I mentioned, I like to run one of them, even if you aren't really planning to splash. If you did pick up like a Course to Kill, then it's going to be one of those things where you have to debate whether or not it's worth affecting your mana base in an aggro situation for the Coerce to Kill. A lot of times I'll lean into it being not worth it unless I get a lot of escape tunnels and kind of the lands that help you fix. So, but I will include the escape tunnel even if I'm not splashing. Hope that makes sense. As far as picks 8 and onward, this is kind of like how many cards can I anticipate on wheeling. And the ones that I look to wheel are Offender at Large, which is a 5/4 with disguise that gives something +2/+0. It works particularly well if you're playing the Fester Leeches and like all these little 1/1s that are kind of annoyingly hard to block, because then they can trade with the ward creatures. And you can also flip this up to deal 7 damage with the Pyrotechnic Performer, and I've just been very impressed with Offender at Large, and very surprised that it's still available on the wheel so late into the format. Snarling Gorehound is another one that I look to take on the wheel. You got a 1/1 menace that, with all of your other 1/1s and disguise creatures and whatnot, triggers Surveil, which really helps smooth your lands in the early part so that you don't stumble on your early aggression, since you do want to finish the game out quickly, and this card helps you do just that. And then similarly, the Alley Assailant, I'm not usually a big fan of this, but in this archetype, giving Alley Assailant menace early on turn 4 to attack in as a 3/3 menace is particularly good. And then later in the game, when you are looking for top decks, Alley Assailant is actually pretty good because you can flip it up to deal the 3 damage and gain 3 life, and I've found that to be very relevant in the match that I trophied. I think actually 2 out of the 7 wins were from Alley Assailant specifically, if I remember correctly. And then last but not least here, the Chase is On. Works particularly well with the double strike creature, the Basher. A lot of times this is straight up a 1-for-1 trade, or sometimes you even get a 2-for-1 trade, depending on how much pressure and what the blocking situation is for your opponent. And then similar to Auspicious Arrival, I have been very impressed with the combat tricks because of the ward being able to protect you from 2-for-1 from your opponent's removal, and then the Investigate afterwards gives you card draw to replace it. So even if your combat trick is trading 1-for-1, you're up in value over time with this. And then if you have a 1/1 that's unblocked in this archetype from going wide, it also just deals 3 damage for 3 mana, which is fantastic. So this week I'll be covering 2 more archetypes, and then next week I'll be covering the final 2 to wrap things up before I take a break, so that there will be nothing left uncovered. So there won't be any poll or vote on YouTube until I return for OTJ or Outlaws at Thunder Junction. So let me know if you liked how I covered the cards in less specific detail this week, or if you'd like me to go back to describing each card. I'm especially interested from hearing from the audio-only listeners in the crowd, because some people, like, they know what the card is, but they don't know the name of it. But I also kind of don't want to just keep describing every single detail. So let me know what you think would be a good solution. I do really appreciate your feedback. Love hearing from you guys. So if you're new here, remember to hit like and subscribe for near daily Magic the Gathering content. And thanks for listening and being a part of my community. Good luck with your games and future trophies. Thank you all for the support, and I'll see you tomorrow.